Oh, it looks like Daniello. I'm sorry if I don't say your name correctly. Has an interesting question here. And also, it looks like he's working on a very cool animated series, which would be nice to see the whole thing. But the question is, why is the preview window red? And it's making it difficult for him to edit. So let's discuss this issue and see what he can do. By looking at his posted images there, we can see that his project is almost an hour long, so it's a pretty big project. And the other thing that we can make out is that the down on the timeline, the video is not fully rendered. And that's basically the issue with his question. Why is it red in the preview but not in there? It's because it's not fully rendered. Filmora uses a technique of what's called a lazy load. That is, it loads a low resolution file, allows you to start editing right away. And then while you're editing, or in the background rather, when you're not editing but thinking about something, it will render the file. And you render it in the preview. There's two renders that occur. There's a render that occurs when you export, and that's when all the tracks are combined and everything's combined into one single track. And the preview render is something that is kind of the same thing, but it only applies to the preview mode. Now, in order for him to speed things up, he needs to look at his file preferences. So we go into Preferences, and we go over to Performance. During the installation, his hardware was checked to see whether what type of GPU he has, because in the modern Filmora, it likes to take advantage of what's called ray tracing, and that's particularly true for animation, but it's also true for all other kinds of media, whether it be images or whether it be video. And so certain accelerations will be applied with that. In other words, instead of doing the computations on the CPU, the computations are being done on the GPU because it can be done faster that way. Okay, but basically that's preset. But he should check to make sure that if he has an RTX card, that it is actually activated. And if he doesn't have an RTX card, it should definitely not be activated because it actually slows things down. Okay, so how can he speed things up? Well, make sure that the render is turned on, background render is turned on, so it does render eventually. And he can have it start after whatever, 5 seconds is the default. But more importantly, he should be using proxy files. Proxy files are used only during the editing process, and what they are copies of the actual media into a lower resolution file. And you have some automatic limits. The default limits are, are you higher than 2K or HD, or are you higher than this still image resolution, which actually is fairly high. By lowering these, you can create a proxy file with a much lower resolution, but adequate for editing, not for playing back. Then whatever changes you make to this proxy file will then be applied to the final original media when you go to export. And likewise, if you lower the resolution for an image that's brought into the project, that will also be applied to the original high quality image that you actually imported. And then finally, use this playback using the latest rendering engine, just in case you should have two GPUs on your system. So anyway, that should be set. Now, one other thing about this is that over here in the media cache, this proxy file section can either be automatically cleared when every time you close the project. The problem with that is if you're doing many edits to it, coming back and working on the project a number of different times, you're probably better off leaving this turned off as opposed to turned on, because then each time you open up the project, all of the files that you have in there are going to get, the proxy files are going to get recreated, and that is just going to slow down your uploading process. And what I'm going to demonstrate this, or I'm going to try to demonstrate it by loading in a very big file, and then we can actually observe the processes in time. And so, yeah, I mean in real time. So I'm going to start the task manager. Here's the task manager, and I'm going to go into the performance tab so we can see what's happening at the CPU, GPU, and on the hard drive. The hard drive only comes mostly into effect when you are loading your files, but somewhat too when you're editing. It just has to do with read-write speeds, and that can slow you down. But mainly what we're going to find out is that the GPU, no matter how big or massive your memory is on the GPU, I have 24 gigabytes, it's going to max out at 100% and not even be using but a fraction of this, because there are different cores in the GPU that handle different things, and the ray tracing is the key. And you'll see that the 3D here will spike and the video decode will spike when we bring it down to the timeline. And I'm thinking that maybe I should probably, I'm going to move this out of the view here for a second, go back into preferences, and I'm going to turn off the creating proxy files. I'm going to go with just the actual resolution. So I'm going to import a file, and I'm going to, I got a 3 gigabyte file here. Let's see. Here's a 6 gigabyte file. That ought to make it go slow. I'm going to bring this back here just so we can see it. I'm going to slide it over here. And we're going to open this file. And of course, it's going to ask me to create a proxy file because I've chosen not to. I'm going to say no. And so nothing is happening over here because I'm not creating a proxy file. We're going to maybe try to, well, you know what? Okay, first of all, let me just drop it down on the timeline and let's see what happens. And again, we're going to match the media of this file. You can see this is a 5K file, so it's definitely high resolution. And we can see here on the timeline, there goes the render, and it's rendering. And what we're seeing during the rendering is this spike that's happening here and here, and the utilization of the GPU says it's 100%, even though I'm only using 3 gigabytes out of the 24. And that's because there are only a certain number of cores that handles the ray tracing. You'll see that there is a lot of activity on the hard drive, and again, a SSD would make this process go faster. And there is some spiking in the GPU, but it's not as severe as the spiking that's occurring down here. So let me just move it out of the way, and let's click this button here, which zooms to fit. And now we can see that this is a very slow rendering process. Again, I'll bring this in. We can see that we're maxing out the GPU. Now, if you don't have a ray tracing GPU, all of this computation will occur up here on the CPU at a much slower process. And you can also see here there is some spiking on the hard hard drive. So these really affect the processing of your files. And this is going to cause that red effect that you have there because you're not fully rendered. You've only gone through the lazy load. You haven't gone through the preview render. And keep in mind that this is the rendering that occurs only for the purposes of editing your video, not for exporting it. It will go through this same process when you go to export. And all this time here, this thing has been running like crazy. And if we go up here, my GPU is only a 3.2 gigahertz GPU, but it can overclock to 6 gigahertz. So if you can't overclock on this, this is also going to slow you down. And we can see that everything is dropping off, and that is because we are done rendering. So this is what's happening, and this will interfere with the your editing. Now, proxy files will load much faster here, and I even forgot what settings we had. Did I actually turn on the? I didn't turn on the proxy files. If you have a proxy file, you're going to load into memory a much smaller file. In fact, this is a 6 gigabyte file. If I do with just a normal proxy file, it would become a 1 gigabit file that gets loaded into the preview window, and it goes much faster. So let me just see if I go in here. Well, let's see if we can make it happen here. Preferences, performance, and I did not have the. Remember, I had a 5K video. That's what this is right here. And if I had activated this, I would have gotten a 2K video, and which I could have made even smaller here. But I'm just going to leave it at default. And let's see what happens. And we're going to apply that. And we can see this little circle that's right here. You see it's black. And actually, and I'm going to let it sit here, and I'm going to just pause the video while this starts to generate the proxy file. This is going to take some while to create. So as we could see, and actually during this demonstration, I didn't realize why it wasn't rendering or creating the proxy file, and that's because it was so big. So I switched over to a smaller 1 gigabyte file, and you saw that slow rendering process. So now there is a proxy file created for it, and each time you go in there and open it up, the lower resolution file will be loaded. The green line will appear faster on the timeline, showing that it's fully rendered, and you should not be experiencing that red effect in the preview window.